the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you are answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. At the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
It's always great to come out to see kind of the students that we always think about, the leaders of tomorrow as well. So kind of really starting to thinking about the role that everybody has as part of whether it's business or public sector, and kind of making sure that we can all work towards a more sustainable world. So what I thought I would do today over the next probably 40 minutes or so is to just take you through a little bit of like the organization that I work for, UN Global Compact, what that is and what we do. Then, as kind of the title of the talk too, we do want to talk a bit about the Sustainable Development Goals, and where I'm coming from there is obviously then what is the role of business as being part of solving some of the global challenges. At the end, we can kind of see how much time we have left. We have some case examples and so forth. They can kind of help you see how that works within different businesses. But I'm also very happy to kind of just have a conversation with you. So I've been told that we do questions mostly at the end. But if it's something burning, feel free to kind of just raise your hand, and we can kind of start the conversations there. So maybe just for me to know a little bit more about you. How many of you know about the Sustainable Development Goals? So that's good. That makes me happy. The rest of you will get up to speed. And how many of you have heard about the UN Global Compact before? That's not an unusual scenario. And I think where we sit is on 44th Street and 1st Avenue at the UN as part of the UN headquarters. And for many, it's not necessarily always the first thing they think about, that the United Nations also works with business. But that is exactly what our office do. So we started, I even just jump into it. The office was started in 2000 after an inspiring speech by Kofi Annan, then Secretary General, about trying to bring business into the conversation. Like when we look about how the society and the world is developing, and obviously a lot of the responsibility falls on government when it comes to taking care of its people, but as business was getting a stronger and more powerful role in all kind of political and economical developments, it's also really, really critical that they are part of the conversation and at the table when these things are being discussed. Back then, there was a lot of conversations around globalizations, the positive and negative impacts of that, and it kind of feels that we're still talking about that, right? So it's not that different, but what he was really calling to was to put a human face to this and really think about what is the impact of what we do as a business, what does that impact the societies and the people living in that, and obviously also thinking about the environment and so forth. So then the Global Compact was founded. At that point, it was an early start kind of pilot office as part of a special initiative under the Secretary General and has then evolved since. But what we're really working to now is this is our mission, is really to mobilize a global movement of sustainable companies and stakeholders to create the world we want. And we'll get into what the world we want really are, and then also thinking about the importance of always thinking about these things in multi-stakeholder perspectives. So what we started with probably 40 companies back then, trying to kind of rally CEOs around the world to see does it make sense to have kind of this type of compact between business and kind of the global leaders to discuss and kind of take action on some of the core issues that are kind of important for all of us. Today, we're 9,500 companies that are signed up, and it's truly global. It's important for us that, as obviously also as part of the UN and how the world develops, it has to be voices from everywhere. So what we're asking companies to do is to have, from a CEO level, they commit to working with the UN and kind of and how to become more sustainable, how to run their companies more sustainable, respecting core principles that we lay out. So when you commit to working with the Global Compact, you commit to a set of 10 principles that covers human rights, labor issues, environment, and anti-corruption. So that's kind of also then tells you that it's taking a very holistic approach to sustainability, which also is important. Over the last few, I think the kind of narrative is changing a bit the last few years, but I think in the beginning, even when companies were starting to talk about sustainability and so forth, it was a lot on the environmental side, which is obviously important, but equally important is also to think about the social and human aspects of all of that. So that's kind of always been our approach to it. It's really thinking about it from all different angles. And it means, as I was alluding to a little bit earlier, we do work with, like, as a multi-stakeholder initiatives. It's really, our role is kind of really to be a convener. So like you bring business to the table, you bring governments to the table, you bring civil society and increasingly also investors to have a part of the conversations. How do we create and enable the market drivers that we all need? I always think about it sometimes when you sit in an office and it's a global initiative, you're kind of a little bit removed from what happens on the ground. But what always gets to me is like when you think about these 9,500 companies, even if it's a small part of every company in the world, we're working on that, and you're still affecting you still have the power to have 66 million people to understand and work on these issues. And I think in these days, when we talk a lot about what are our action also as civil or as people living in the society, I think as an employee of a business, even if you can't solve the full problem yourself, I think everybody has a role, and really trying to mobilize that and think about big or small, what is it that we can do to really have the respect and drive the opportunities for sustainable business. It's something that should be a part of everyone's role, at least in our opinions. I think it started in 2000, I said. In 2015, a big thing also happened at the UN from our perspective, where the world came together and agreed on 17 sustainable development goals. It was significant for many reasons. A, you have 193 governments who actually agrees to something. That's big in itself. But I think for the UN, it was also the first time that we brought private sector directly into the conversation. So as part of the way that we worked with in the consultation up to creating these 17 goals, it was also bringing in CEOs and other people in companies around the world to really hear what is it that business can do to help solve these challenges. And when you look at them, they might seem many, but the interesting part is, I think, from anything that UN ever has put out, this one has actually been picked up quite easily by the business community. Many still obviously need to understand what they are, but when you start thinking about it, these are really kind of a roadmap for our future. So it's about thinking about what are the biggest challenges we as a world are facing when we think about the next, at that point, 15 years. These are set to be met by 2030. What is it that we need to do? This then includes ending poverty, ending hunger, reducing inequality, making sure that we have more stable societies. It's a very wide agenda, but when you start looking at it, you kind of also start understanding that's very hard to start cutting there. And one question that we sometimes always get is also, where's human rights in all of this? And I think how we can think about it and how it was developed is also think human rights are essential for all of these aspects. It's integrated into everything from decent job to the environment and to kind of the strong institutions and so forth. So we'll get much more into detail about the goals and what we're seeing companies do, but it is important. It is an important milestone and something that we now very actively work as part of our agenda. So how do we do that? There's different ways that companies engage with us. What I didn't mention on the previous slides is that we are headquartered here in New York, but we also have 70 local networks around the world. So meaning national offices in 70 countries that work in kind of contextualizing and making sure they're working on the issues that are most pressing for that specific country, whether it's water or anti-corruption issues or environmental issues. Many of these will obviously be relevant for all, but you kind of can adjust a little bit to what the priorities are. But what we really do is that we provide a platform for business leaders to come forward and kind of share their commitments to being a part of this and how they are seeing that their business has a role in developing the societies. We help them achieve their sustainability objectives, or really business objectives, through tools, through workshops, and so forth, around the world on different issues, whether it's cross-cutting issues from working with investors to digging into water and human rights issues that kind of depend on the companies we work with, but it has a lot of action platforms and learning sessions and so forth that we engage business on a daily basis. And then, yeah, we bring them really together to really help shape it. Like, we don't have all the answers, so it's really about coming together as a group of stakeholders, with business being a key part of it, to think about how do we solve these challenges, what is the challenges that the businesses are experiencing, and so forth. I think through kind of the history of sustainability, it started a lot with a focus on risk, and we're increasingly now also starting to look at what does the business opportunities look like. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But before we get there, I think what is useful to think about, I like to start with something positive, is that, and the Global Compact cannot take credit for all of this, but I do think since 2000, when the Global Compact started, there has been a lot of positive developments in the world. We have significantly reduced poverty and people living in like with kind of the extreme poverty is almost solved. Obviously, there's still big challenges left, but there are kind of, you can see and you can measure a lot of progress. Also, when it comes to equality issues, gender, children, so forth, there are a lot of positive developments that we are seeing, and we're not necessarily hearing so much about in the news, but it doesn't mean that they're not happening, which we should think about, because as soon as you put kind of issues out there, if we come together to solve things, there's actually possible to make quite significant progress. But there are a lot of challenges still. This picture is obviously from more of the developing country perspective, but I think equally we could have put up a picture from the hurricanes that we're experiencing here in New York, or not New York, but in the US, from kind of the Me Too campaigns and the inequality issues and so forth. I think how we address the issues and even the goals is to think about them as global issues. They really are, and they affect each country and individuals differently, but it comes to the core for everyone. And that means, like, we still have a lot of challenges to solve. Even 3 years in, we always do kind of a status report where we look at, or the UN looks at, how are we faring on achieving the goals. And there's huge challenges that we need to get to. Inclusivity is obviously a big one. Like, we need to have more equal opportunities for people, whether it's income inequality or gender equality or what it is. Climate, obviously, which we will talk a little bit more about also. But also things like the youth, the next generation. When we look around the world, what is the future workforce going to look like? What are the jobs of the future? We are seeing, like, much higher risk of young people today being unemployed than what their parents were. So there's a lot of social issues that impacts at all levels that we all need to keep track on. And then we had last Monday, I don't know how many of you saw it, but it was covered across the news that the climate change issues are really real. We're not going to debate where they come from, but it's affecting everyone. And the UN published a report through their advisory panel that puts out that we pretty much have 12 years left to figure out our stuff and come up with new solutions and decarbonize the world. So I think obviously that's, for many, it's shocking, and it's a lot of like you get kind of like, okay, what's really going to happen? At the same time, we kind of want to think about there's never been a better time for them also to then really start working on these issues and really think about innovation and really think about solutions that we know are working, but we know it needs to change. So we don't really have more time to lose on this. So I think that's also interesting to hear where you guys are in the school that you're going from, because I think for the future we need to think quite differently about the products and the business models that we are creating. So that brings us back to then. I think within each of these areas, there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of risks that we need to come together around. And what the UN, as I was talking about, and everybody else is kind of starting to rally around is the only way we can do that is if business is a part of it. Government is not going to be able to solve this alone, so we really need business and investors to think about this and be a part of the solutions and create the new products that and business models that we need for that. And luckily, we're not the only one who says it. We also have a lot of business leaders who kind of are on the same. Paul Polman is our vice chair on our board and works a lot with us on that. But I think even from the 9,500 companies that we're working with, 80% of them are saying they are taking action that they do believe can have an impact on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we need more of that. We need the kind of businesses everywhere to kind of stand up to the leadership, whether it's about different solutions or new ways to work together, or being part of kind of responsible public lobbying and so forth, that it comes into all aspects of how they conduct themselves as leaders and what the purpose of their business are. So what does that mean then? I thought I could kind of try to make it a little bit more tangible, but just talking about what we are asking companies to do, on how, when they come to us and say, but what does all of this mean? What should I do? What's the role of my business? So we have come up together with a number of businesses with kind of a 5-step getting started model, which is still high level, but it hopefully gives you a little bit of food for thought and kind of what this means regardless of the role that you are in. And obviously it can also be used for non-private sector if that's where you end up. But first of all, I guess understanding what the goals are and the role of the business is important. We talked a little bit about that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but there's still a few nuances that are important. So what we talked about is really, I think at least what helps me and many others is really to think about this rather than 17 goals, what are they there for? So with goals, it's really about where we want to go. So to us, it's kind of a blueprint of where we should be in 2030, which is the deadline for the goals. So we can track them and actually kind of work towards them. If 17 goals is not enough for you, it's actually 169 targets that comes with them, so you can really dig into it. But it gives us, for once, really good tracking opportunities and kind of being able to speak the same language. What are we trying to achieve? And then also, yeah, as an investor and as a business people, it's also interesting, you already know what governments are going to focus on. You know that these challenges exist and that there will be huge opportunities to come up with the solutions for that. So if it's ending poverty, that means that a lot of different new products needs to be out there. It needs to be thinking about, are we having the right food? If we're not going to eat that much meat anymore, what does that look like from new type of plant-based diets and so forth? There's a lot of room for innovation, and the same comes for affordable housing. The same comes from grappling with social issues and so forth. So there, you can kind of start also looking into each of them and think about, what could I do as a business, or what is the products that could help actually solve that? And you're automatically a part of really driving that. And the purpose is really to create a more equal world where no one is being left behind, so that we don't widen the divide that's already there now, but rather find a way to close it where both businesses and society can thrive together. So from the Global Compact's perspective and the UN overall, that kind of means two things, as we already have touched a little bit on. It really is about making sure you act responsible. That kind of takes us back a little bit to the principles. Make sure that you have policies and actions in place, that you're not breaching human rights or basic human rights. there's still a lot, like we always say this, in some ways you want to think about that as a problem solved, but it really isn't. You can see it mostly in pretty every multinational, and that's not even going down to the smaller businesses. They still struggle with finding the solution to this. Same with labor issues, decent work for everyone. What does that mean? I think there's no one who can say that they have that completely solved either, but it's really thinking about making sure you do no harm as a business. But then as soon as you kind of have that, like you looked at that, you should, like it's also important to think about opportunities. Like that's what business do. So we also want to keep that lens to that. What does it mean when it comes to new opportunities for you as a business and what you're creating and what you're investing in? And that's a report a couple of years ago now that was done by not just the UN, but a lot of CEOs as part of the Business for Sustainable Development, including Pullman, the CEO of McKinsey, and so forth, did a lot of research and reports to figure out, okay, so what does this mean from a business perspective? If you take away all the kind of moral responsibilities that we have, what is also the kind of concrete business opportunities? And they came by looking at a number of different areas, and not even everything from that you can think of, to find a $12 trillion market opportunity or business opportunity, which also is helpful, as we said, to kind of just think about it. It is good for the world, but it can also be very good for business. So then back to kind of 17 goals, 169 targets. Okay, so where do you start? And that is what we have talked a little bit about. It's really first start by looking across your business, and that means also across the entire value chains. How do you make sure you minimize the negative risks that you're having? Anything that can negatively impact the societies and the planet and the environment should be taken into consideration. A lot of people do risk assessments or human rights risk assessments and so forth to really kind of map the business of what they're doing and start working from there. And second, look at the opportunities, as we talked about, across your operations, across your services, and across anything that you do as part of your core business. It is what many people do, as we said, it's like you kind of look across the value chain and you kind of map this out and you see how it works. But it's important to understand also, like, it's not about a perfect sum. You can't trade off. Like, you can't do one thing and think that makes up for abuses in other places. But it's still helpful to kind of keep both the risk and positive in mind. And so that means, from what we say, we call that then is like a principle-based approach to prioritization. Which means that you have to kind of think about across the full spectrum, so kind of take the holistic approach. This example might not say a lot right there, but it's about a clothing company that decided already that they wanted to be a responsible new fashion company, which means, okay, they're thinking, okay, I'm positively impacting the goal 12 for responsible consumption or in production. I'm also going to do it in a very responsible way, so I'll make sure that the water risks are well taken care of, and we're going to work on this. But what you also have to do is, at the same time, those things are super important, and that's part of your plan, but what about the labor that you use? Does that look like? Make sure that you also, through the supply chains then, have decent work conditions for everyone and have regulations in place for that. So it doesn't help if you're just like an eco-friendly fashion company. You also need to make sure that you have everything in order also on the social side. I think another example on that is last year we had a big conference in India where we were looking for kind of regional speakers to talk about some of the innovations that they were most excited about. We were super excited when we then found they had just opened the world's biggest solar plant at that point, not that far away from where we were. So we're like, that's perfect. But then at the same time, when you look a little bit under the hood again, looking at kind of the working conditions and the social issues, that was not the same glorious story. So it's really important to kind of think about it from the big picture. And it's not to discourage people to say, like, in some ways everything counts, but it's also really important to make sure that you make an impact, and the strongest impact, by making sure that it's not having any negative impacts other places. So to us, that means you can definitely benefit from that. You reduce the risks that you can experience. You make sure that all your resources align your company strategy and efforts. It really helps you kind of take the big picture to it. Everyone should be involved. But it's importantly also you do identify the new business models and the new opportunities. And you avoid what we call here cherry picking and SDG washing, which for those of you who might become or already are sustainability nerds, that kind of talks to the importance of not just picking what's easy and communicating about that, or just kind of putting some SDG pictures to the strategies that you're already having, or kind of, not taking the holistic approach, which is really, really important. And it kind of takes it from kind of a communication exercise to really being a part of your core issue or core business. So then it comes to goal setting. For any business, that's obviously important. So they need their own goals. And what we have kind of started to talk about there with a lot of the businesses that we work with is, of course, that should follow standard procedure of how you usually set goals. They should be measurable, they should be time-bound, specific, and ambitious to really get to where they want to be. But increasingly, you should also kind of think about an additional lens of, is it aligned with the needs of the people on the planet? What does that mean, and kind of in the way that you play your role in society? So currently, I would say status quo, I think for us is definitely not enough, and we all need to kind of increase the sustainability performance. So we need to find a way to close this gap. And we think the one way to do this is if businesses, as part of their goal setting, which typically have been very focused on an inside-out approach. You focus on historical data, current trends, benchmarking to peers, so forth. It all makes sense, obviously, and you should continue to do that. But also think about what's around you. So taking an outside-in perspective to when you as a business set your internal goals, is that enough? Or can you think about it in a bigger picture where it's what's the external and societal data telling you that you really need to improve on, or where you can be a part of the solution? And science and external data is really available now, and there's a lot of companies starting to look at this. Like, what does that mean? So a couple of those, if you want to kind of check it out a little bit after the class, two of the ones that we work very closely with is science-based targets for greenhouse emissions, which really looks at the science behind it, trying at the moment that they kind of vet the goals towards the Paris Agreement deal, where it's 2-degree limit, but I think increasingly they're also going down to the 1.5 and trying to work with businesses to say, if that's what's happening in the world, what does that look for your business? You set very specific targets that are aligned with that. And the same with context-based targets for water. It's not just about reducing your direct issues, but also thinking about it in the bigger picture and using data from external sources to see how you're impacting that at a larger scale. And after the goal setting, I think we talked a little bit about it, but it's then important that it doesn't just remain on paper or remain as a CEO top-level commitment that they like to talk about when they're at global conferences. It's really about integrating into the core business and making sure that it's part of everyone's role. So that's the way you can have the most impactful action. And I think this group is probably not the worst, but you could still be surprised of how many times we need to have the conversation that sustainability is not philanthropy. It's not kind of a nice side activity that you do on the side. It's really a part of the way that you do business, and where you can have the most impact is when what you're doing is really your core business. So if you are a beverage company, water is a huge issue, and you can have amazing impact there if you have the right programs in place. If you want to sponsor some charity in your community, that's also great, but it's not when you're going to have the same massive impact at scale. Obviously, depending a little bit about the situation, but you get the point. So that's what we're also saying. You need to make sure then that it's a part of everyone's role. So whether it's marketing, whether it's supply chain management, whether it's R&D, whether it's the investor relations, they all need to be part of this and have goals that they also track so that their performance is actually measured towards this as well, not just the latest quarterly earning results. So it needs to be embedded into strategy, what we say also culture, really importantly, and the operation, so from headquarters down to the last supply chain. So that's what kind of the three things that some of the businesses are saying is helping them on this is really, okay, create a shared understanding. So a little bit of what we've gone through today too. What does it mean for your business? What does it mean for the specific unit of the business? Make sure that they are evaluated on this. I think we see this across starting, you can see some executive members who are starting to have sustainability and climate and social issues as part of the way that they're actually being evaluated in their performance, and other functions should also have the same. I think obviously, as you know, I think there's obviously a lot of sustainability managers out there, but you get the point that they can obviously drive a lot of this, but they can't be alone in the company. And the same, communicate about it. Communicate internally, communicate externally, everything that it makes, so it's kind of really part of the core narrative and the mission of the company. So then we're getting to the last one of this circle. It's really about external communication also and reporting. A lot of companies are now reporting on their sustainability efforts. And the Global Compact also has a requirement for people to send on an annual basis to kind of have a communication on progress that typically looks like their sustainability report, but when you kind of address the progress that you're making across these issues. But it's also, it is an increasing stakeholder demand, and we've seen that increasing a lot the last 10 years, and I think the societies and businesses, it's hard to not be transparent these days, because one day or another it's going to come to surface. So I think also on the sustainability issues, there are investors asking questions, there are the media asking questions, there's civil society asking questions, that you kind of need to be able to explain your position and what you're doing or what you're not doing. Investors are, at least at the highest level, also now starting to talk, like the ESG evaluations is rising very quickly, and it's also starting to have conversations with companies on this. So they might not call it sustainability or SDGs, but we know the climate risk, for example, is huge. So that has to be a part of what the investors talk about. Labor issues are also the same. Like, it kind of impacts the value of your company and the way how well that is being run, also by looking at these issues. So what many companies are doing as they go through different materiality exercises and so forth to really kind of get to what is it that's most core for my business and prioritize from there. So I think that's kind of a very simplified version, obviously, but you kind of get the idea of how you can take it from very abstract goals and targets to start, or from at the global level, to start really integrating it as part of the core business.